while he was getting ready for school. So that was a good thing. And it helps me too, because all of my sermon ideas that I had for the teens, I've used in the adults now. They were just fitting for the adults. So I got to put my head back into the teens again. So in a couple of weeks here, Pastor Dan will come up here and he will continue his 2 Timothy series. Are you done yet? Close to done? Halfway done?
2 Timothy chapter 2.
Okay, chapter 2. A little ways to go yet. All right, very good. So we'll get him back up here just as soon as we can. All right, now tonight what we have is an exposition of verse 12. Look at verse 12. Marvelous things did he in the sight of their fathers in the land of Egypt in the field of Zoan. Come over to verse 41. Yea, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. That's the pattern we've been following. As we've gone through this series, we've been following the pattern, these mentions of offense. And we're at offense number 6. Now, this sounds familiar to some things that he has said already. Turned back, tempted God. But tonight now we have a little bit of a different language, different wording in that it says they limited the Holy One of Israel. They remembered not his hand. They remembered not his hand. And so he's going to explain how they did not remember his hand. Come back to verse 42. They remembered not his hand, nor the day when he delivered them from the enemy, how he had wrought his signs in Egypt and his wonders in the field of Zoan, and had turned their rivers into blood and their floods that they could not drink. He sent diverse sorts of flies. So that word, that's the Old English spelling for diverse. You and I are used to seeing it with an E on the end. Diverse sorts of flies among them, which devoured them, and frogs, which destroyed them. He gave also their increase unto the caterpillar, and their labor unto the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail, and their sycamore trees with frost. He gave up their cattle also to the hail, and their flocks to hot thunderbolts. He cast upon them the fierceness of his anger, wrath, and indignation, and trouble, by sending evil angels among them. He made a way to his anger. He spared not their soul from death, but gave their life over to the pestilence, and smote all the firstborn in Egypt, the chief of their strength in the tabernacles of Ham, but made his own people to go forth like sheep, and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. And he led them on safely, so that they feared not. But the sea overwhelmed their enemies, and he brought them to the border of his sanctuary, even to this mountain, which his right hand hath purchased. He cast out the heathen also before them, and divided them an inheritance by line, and made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. Look at verse 56. We'll come back to this next week. Yet they tempted him. Here we go again. They continued to require God to prove himself. And what he's going to say here, his challenge is this in verses 41 to 55. How much more proof could you possibly need than what God did in Israel, especially in Exodus chapter 7 all the way over to chapter 11? How much more could God possibly do? So here again, we see the same language in verse 41, that they had turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. So they were testing him. They were proving him. They were telling him, God, you prove yourself. I don't like what I got. I don't like what I saw. And so I'm beginning to doubt you. I'm beginning to question your love, question your power, question your integrity. And so what happened is, the word there, limited, is a little, to us in our vernacular today, it means something a little bit different. But to them, to the Old English, it means grieved. It comes from the idea of grieved. It means to pain. It means to cause a wound or to cause pain, to pain somebody or to wound them. So they grieved the Holy One, the Sacred One. the set apart one. In other words, they thought small of God and doubted his ability and doubted his power. They were beginning, again, we saw this before. They were not thankful. And so what happened now is we're learning, number one there, we're learning in our notes that Ephraim or Israel became a lesson on how God's people could ignore his great kindness. How could God's people ignore his great kindness? In order to make God a despot, in order to make him some kind of tyrant, you must first imagine him to be unkind. Did you hear that? In order to doubt God, in order to imagine God being unkind, to be to be this grandfatherly figure with a baseball bat just waiting to whack you, you have to find some reason or justification to imagine him to be so. Do you see and hear the need for a godly imagination? Because what we imagine to be true, we act on. The things we don't imagine to be true, we don't take those things seriously. And so all the people who want to, a lot of people want to say, well, I believe God. The problem is they do not imagine him to be true. They're paying him lip service. In the off chance, God will look past that and he will give them a nod and a wink when they come to glory, when they get to the gate of St. Peter. As if somehow that's how heaven is set up, all right? Peter has no such responsibility at all in the scriptures, all right? So, what we're finding out here is he's going to make this case now in verses 41 to 55. He's trying to get Israel to remember, listen, you were favored at Egypt's expense. Things were done for you that Egypt could only imagine. And remember, we have confirmation for a large part of the plagues, not all of it, but for the large part of the plagues, that nothing came nigh the dwelling of the Israelites. In fact, Pharaoh sent a guard to go in and look. Did it happen to them too? And they came back and said, no, they're untouched. Nothing's changed for them. Oh, those Israelites. Well, how did they do this? How did they work this out? And so the question you have to ask yourself when we come to our text here is, how does anyone forget the mighty works such as plagues? I mean, these things were not done privately. Pastor Charles Spurgeon said it this way: the plagues were ensigns of Jehovah's presence and proofs of his hatred of idols. These instructive acts of power were wrought in the open view of all, as signals are set up to be observed by those far and near. This was all done openly. This was all done out in visible, in a visible place in the field of Zoan, it actually says, in the field of Zoan. And so none of this, there's no secrecy here. There's no reason to think at any time that somehow these people missed it, or Israel didn't catch it, or Israel didn't witness it in living color, because they did. And yet, notice here, back at verse 41, they did three things, right? Well, actually four things. They turned back, they tempted God, they limited the Holy One of Israel, and they remembered not his hand. They did not recall, they did not call to mind his hand, thereby signifying his strength, his power. They did not, what is it that they didn't remember, that they didn't bring to mind? Well, the day that he delivered them from the enemy, the day that he ransomed them, the day that he redeemed them from their moment of distress. Enemy is actually one of the meanings of this word. This word means it's the idea of being squeezed, to be in distress. And an enemy will do that to you. an enemy that's putting the squeeze on God's people. But now that they're out of the pressure, they've forgotten who rescued them. Are you guilty of that? Have you ever prayed, God, redeem me, get me out of this situation, help me get out of this? And then someday, 5 years later, you realize, that really frightened me. And somehow I've forgotten all about it. How did that happen? Well, the problem is for Israel, that forgetfulness, they didn't ever recall it to mind. So what happened is now, not only are they not remembering God's hand, they're not remembering God's hand because they're starting to entertain the idea that, was it really that bad? Was it really that intense that I had to be so afraid? And now they've forgotten the size of their problem, the size of their enemy. And so they don't remember how big God was. How quick we are to forget those things that God does for us. It's good for us to rehearse those good things that God has done on our behalf. Maybe a little notepad. Sharon and I used to. We haven't done it for a long time now. We had a notebook we used to keep, answered prayer requests in. And to our discredit, we don't do it anymore. But boy, somebody else told us to do that, and we did that, and it was fun just to flip through there. Maybe keep some of these prayer sheets that we have. I know I have one here. There it is. All right, especially some where we had big needs. Maybe you don't have to save them all, but save some and just take them out once in a while and go, man, thank you, God. I remember that. I remember when so-and-so was so sick. I remember when, as a church, this is the fun one. Remember when we were praying for that parking lot? And it's just a stupid parking lot that we run our cars on. And kids come here and roach their tires on and the geese poop on. But you know what? It was such a need to our safety and our well-being and a good testimony to our neighbors. And look at how far past we are already. This furnace, we weren't even thinking about replacing this furnace until this fall. And the Lord provided it last fall. But keep going there. When was the last time you asked God to give you something, really eternal? Like an answered prayer, maybe salvation in somebody else's heart and life, maybe a depth of faith. Do you pray for patience? I know. That's terrifying, right? Lord, grant me patience, but please hurry. You've all seen that, haven't you? That little caption. How about long suffering? Lord, help me to endure this coworker. They need the Lord. I know they do. But boy, they make me want to quit right now, right here. Lord, help me. Give me a right heart. Help me to see them like you do. And you know what? Over time, your heart will preserve itself in thankfulness. In thankfulness. Keep going here to our text. He had wrought signs. He had wrought his signs in Egypt. The word here is literally signals. That's why that quote by Spurgeon stood out to me so well, because it literally means signals, is signs, flags, banners, monuments, anything that speaks of kind of a person or a power or an entity. He says here, his signs and his wonders. His signs and his wonders. These are conspicuous miracles. And again, notice I already mentioned it, in the field of Zoan. Now, Zoan is a city in Egypt. And interestingly, I never knew this before, not until we did this study. You know what Zoan means? City of departure. And it's up there in Goshen. I'm wondering, I can't help but wonder, is this the place where it happened? Where Israel parted ways with Egypt and said, we're out of here. Just an interesting thing. But I was explaining earlier on, though, that Zoan, earlier on, it becomes a place for princes. It becomes kind of To put it in modern terms, obviously we live a little bit differently than they do, so it's not a perfect analogy, but kind of a playground, like an American Las Vegas. Okay, it's where the princess went. I think once the Israelites left and they realized how much, commerce could be done there, they turned it into something else, not exactly God honoring. All right, he says there, he had turned their rivers. All right, this is any course of water. He had turned their rivers into blood and their floods that they could not drink. Remember, what was the first plague? What was the first plague? Yep, the Nile River turned to blood. And remember, the people, in order to find water, they had to dig away from the river. It was the only way to get any kind of appreciable water that you could possibly drink. Exodus 7, verse 14 to 25 has it there. And to have any kind of water, any kind of usable water, they had to dig. They had to dig away from the shoreline because everything up by the water table along the river was blood. And I don't mean red water. Please understand here. The miracle is not that red algae had crept into the Mediterranean Sea and got into the Nile River, and the Nile suddenly turned red and appeared like blood. The Bible says it was turned to blood. Can you imagine? An entire river system of nothing but fetid blood, and the stench and the stink. Oh, it's amazing. It's amazing to think of that miracle. And here our author, Asaph, is saying, "Oh, Israel, how quickly you have forgotten that God turned an entire river system into actual blood to prove a point to your oppressors." And here we are. And then now here we are, and we're tempting God. God, prove your love. If you're God, you need to show us. How much more could he show you other than that one act? Well, God didn't leave it there. Okay? And you'll think a little bit tonight. All right. Herod's heart was hardened, and the Bible says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Initially, though, the first half, Pharaoh always hardens his heart. Okay, then the last half, God simply commits him to his decision. So Pharaoh is only getting what he wanted to begin with. But you'll notice, think about it as a proof or as a sign or as a signal of God's love to Israel. He finished his affliction of Egypt on their behalf. All right, one of the possible reasons Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Okay, now number 2, or verse 45 actually, sign number 2, he sent diverse sorts of flies. Diverse sorts of flies among them, which devoured them, and frogs which destroyed them. Now these flies, actually the sorts of flies, it's really swarms. The word here is swarms, which presumes some sort of airborne insect, especially some sort of fly. What's interesting is the very, very ancient Septuagint. All right, remember the Septuagint, the LXX? It's the Greek version of the Old Testament. We're talking so ancient. Jesus may have spoken from it in one of his conversations he had. In the Septuagint, it says dog fly. And I thought, is there really a dog fly in the Middle East? And there is. And you know what? This dog fly is ruthless. Look at the words there again. Remember what this fly did to them? It devoured them. Now, we're getting flies in our house right now. They're coming in out of the country. We can smell our food being grown, if you get my drift. All right, the farmers, the ones that already have their crops in, if they have their crops in, they're already starting to put some fertilizer out. And it gives our home a rich, aromatic country air. And And what's happening is now flies are coming in. And we'll get a fly in the house. He'll drive us nuts. But they don't bite. They don't bite. Now, this says here that the flies devoured them, literally ate them up. And believe it or not, the dog fly does exactly that. It's a carnivore. It bites until there's bleeding. And it's really bad for cattle, actually. The cattle in our account here really took a beating. It's amazing to think these flies were ruthless, biting and drawing blood, eating them up. And then you got the frogs. You got the frogs, and here the frogs come in, and of course they're in everything, and they're in everywhere, and you're stepping on them. And if you've ever stepped on a frog that comes out of the river, that's kind of slimy, right? Okay, kind of gross. And when you have a whole bunch of, because even in the tale there of frogs, Exodus chapter 8, they all just die all at once. So guess what's all over the land of Israel? Dead frogs. I'm sure one frog doesn't smell like a whole lot to you and me, but how about a whole land full of frogs? All of a sudden that year, there was no natural predator for the frog. They just populated like you wouldn't believe over and over and over again. And now, so what happens is, the word there that destroyed them, this means they brought corruption. They brought decay. Look at verse 46. He gave also their increase unto the caterpillar and their labor unto the locust. Unto the caterpillar and their labor unto the locust. So in other words, of their produce, of their fruit, of their crops, the caterpillar, this ravager, had come in and ate it up. I don't know about you. This year was one of the best years we have ever had in the garden. And it was funny because I was just complaining on Facebook in the spring about how in the world do I grow cucumbers? I already told you that the cucumbers, they took over the whole garden. They're everywhere. They're all the way over by the grill. Is what they've left the garden and they've headed towards the patio. I have dreams that these cucumbers I'm gonna wake up and they're strangling me. And so, you look at this and you realize all of these plants. I tried broccoli one year. It was full of caterpillars, these little tiny white things. And it was such a bummer. And the nice thing is, I don't need a garden to survive. The Egyptians have to have a garden that will give them an increase. But not only was their fruit eaten, he says their labor also was wasted. It was given to this swarm of locusts or grasshoppers. Okay, it was all gobbled up. All of it, the locusts took everything. And please understand, this is vulnerability on top of vulnerability. The food is gone. What else is gone? Well, maybe water. Yeah, that too. But what else do you get from your fruit? A real farmer doesn't eat everything he grows. Next season's seeds, gone. Not only do they not have food for this year, they now have nothing for next year. You want to see how a drought comes into, a drought's without water. But not having any food. Okay, this is how it happens. All right, here's the fifth sign. He destroyed their vines with hail and sycamore trees with frost. Look at verse 48. He gave up their cattle also to the hail. So you've got this multiple mentions of hail. And which plague had frost? Well, none of them that we know of. And actually, this word is really, really hard, that frost. And I know it's an ancient word. Remember, I was reading the 1562 Geneva last week for fun. And it actually has frost. So frost, it's one of the words. But basically, this is the only place where this word occurs. And interestingly enough, all we know is it is something that kills sycamore trees. That's it. It could be in Mr. Strong's. You're familiar with his work, right? He thinks it's ants. Well, somebody else, one of the other ancient writers was saying it had to be a kind of aphid or some kind of plant louse. And actually, as far as things that can kill sycamore trees go, it could be hail. We don't know. All right, but sycamore trees used to be very common. We tend to think of Zacchaeus and the sycamore tree, but they used to be very common all throughout that region. And it's probably actually, there's a sycamore tree in the Middle East that has fruit, that has a fig on it. So maybe this is a mention here of a fruit tree. The point is this, that all their food was gone. The vines from which they made their wine, gone. And the sycamore trees from which they got their fruit, gone. It's all of it's gone. All right, that's sign number 6. And that one does not exactly relate to the plagues in the book of Exodus. That sign and sign number 7 is why some people will say, was there another incident with Egypt, in which, they left, they were there at Zoan, and then they had to leave. I think it's the same thing. I just think you've got some linguistic difficulties here that time will tell, and God will correct. God will take care of it for us. Notice then, go down to verse 48. Here again, we have the hail plague again. He gave up their cattle, beasts such as cattle, also to the hail. And we know hail can get big. I've been out in one hailstorm, and it hurt like the dickens. It was like an army of kids throwing rocks at me. And we know they can get softball size, some of them. Think of the damage that would do. It'd be about being like stoned to death, especially for even a great big cow. These are beasts. These really could be any kind of beasts of burden, because you'll notice there they have livestock, they have flock kind of animals at the end. They're flocks to hot thunderbolts. The root word there is fire, live coals. But it includes this dashing arrow, this flashing arrow of fire through the air, which sounds like what? Lightning. Yeah, lightning. They've got a more poetic hot thunderbolts. Meteors can even appear that way, the same thing. And we know that not far away in Sodom and Gomorrah, right, they had fire and brimstone come down. So this kind of stuff happened, and we know that the animals were affected by the hail. Sign number 7 again, hot thunderbolts. And actually that as well, it's not that God was out there with some kind of cosmic laser shooting cows. The lightning could have been so proficient that it could have started a fire, whatever it is. Either way, the hail and the thunder or the lightning was killing their animals. And let's be honest, when you've got frogs, you've got flies, you've got locusts, how do you defend against that? You can't. You just can't. And so anyway, he gives us a little bit of a summary here in verse 49. He cast upon them. Okay, here's the thing, because people like to try and explain away these plagues. Well, there was red algae, came into the Nile River, and it gave it the appearance of blood. And of course, red tide is toxic, and so it made you sick. No, it says blood. This is what it means is blood. And when you look at verse 49, you have this confirmation that these things were as bad as they sound. He cast upon them the fierceness of his anger, the heat, the burning of his anger. This is that word we've seen a couple times now in 78, that act. Remember that rage in the face, you see it in the face, the nostrils are flared, that act. And you can see here, this is intense wrath. This is an overflow of fury. It's a burning passion, a rage. God is every bit of angry. God is not holding back. Indignation from a root meaning to froth. All right, to froth at the mouth. He was beside himself with anger and fury and displeasure at their sin. He brought upon them trouble. He brought, again, this tightness. We saw it before. This distress, this trouble, this adversity. And here's how he did it. It actually tells us by sending evil or bad or malignant angels among them. Angels among them. Okay? He made a way to his anger. He spared not. In other words, he did not restrain their soul, their breath, the inner man. He did not restrain it from death. There was no mercy to these who were of the vilest sinners, who were of the vilest kind of people. Notice there, he spared not their soul from death, but gave their life, their living ability, their manner of living. He gave it over to the pestilence, to the plague, to the disease. Sign number 8. Come with me over to Exodus 11. Exodus chapter 11. Because it says here, he made a way, he spared not, he gave their life over, and he smote all the firstborn in Egypt. Look at verse 1, chapter 11. And the Lord said unto Moses, yet will I bring one more plague upon Pharaoh. Look at verse 4. And Moses said, thus saith the Lord, about midnight will I go out into the midst of Egypt. Verse 8, all these thy servants shall come down unto me and bow down themselves unto me, saying, get thee out, and all the people that follow thee, and after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in a great anger. Why would God do that? Verse 9, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land. Look at verse 12. What's our pronoun there? Our pronoun subject. Here's a hint. It's a single letter. I will pass through the land of Egypt this night. I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. All right, and in case you were wondering, is this just an angel of some kind? Look what he says there, end of verse 12. I am the Lord. Verse 13, all right, the blood shall be to you a token upon the houses where ye are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you. Verse 23, we have further confirmation. The Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. So the other plagues were perpetrated by evil angels, by malicious angels. And you could say, I would venture a guess that they were holy angels who were used in judgment. And of course, man is not going to be pleased with anything that comes to judgment. I don't think these are demons that God somehow released or let go. Especially when you consider the fact that God is the one who personally, all right, Pharaoh challenged him to an arm wrestling fight, and God showed up. That's what I'm getting at here. This is an ancient clash of the titans. And of course, Pharaoh tapped out. Pharaoh said, I can't compete with this. Pharaoh had to finally understand that he was no God. Because remember, he was saying in the beginning, earlier on, he was talking like he was a God and he didn't know of any other God. God said, hold my sweet tea. All right, I'm coming to show you something. Okay, and so what you have here, you have God working and taking what belongs to him in the first place. All right, and be careful of letting anybody else imagine something other than a theophany of Jesus here. What you're seeing here, okay, just to connect the dots, what you're seeing here is a Jesus like in Revelation 1. See, the problem is we keep Jesus in the manger. And we've got to remember that he's a mighty God. And in his hand, he carries the keys to death and hell. Now, Be careful. Don't imagine for a moment that God is mean-spirited, malicious, or unfeeling or unjust. Remember when we went through his attributes? This God who challenged the wicked is the same one that is good. Good on our behalf. Patient and long-suffering. When you come to texts like this, you say, oh, how could God do that? You have to remember, for God to do this, he has been patient and he has been long-suffering. God doesn't just come out of the blue and say, you know what, I hate you. He's good. He's gracious. He's kind. And you might remember Romans chapter 9, where he says, I raised you up. I raised you up, Pharaoh. I raised you up for my glory. Pharaoh had a choice. Is it going to be God's glory because I love and serve God? Or is it going to be God's glory because God has to prove that I am no God? Can you think of another mighty king who thought he was a god? And instead, I didn't finish the statement. You're right. That's who it is. It's Nebuchadnezzar. It's Nebuchadnezzar. Only the thing is, Nebuchadnezzar had the sense to fold. He had the sense to say, whoa, all right, you serve that God. Don't you serve any other God, because I'm tired of eating grass. I'm going to serve that God. And of course, it's sad. His grandson never got the message, his son or grandson. Okay? Now, letter A. So we just finished letter A. Notice in there, God had been a deliverer to them in Egypt. God had been a deliverer to them in Egypt. He brought decay to Egypt by the instrument that Egypt had used to destroy the Jewish children. Now Egypt is being destroyed instead. Okay? What Egypt had loved, she now learned to loathe. All right, number 2 there, it says God devoured Egypt's food. God devoured Egypt's food. He brought in decay and he took away their food. Obviously, Pharaoh could do nothing to stop it. Pharaoh was no God. Pharaoh had no claim to any kind of deity or divinity, and God proved it. Number 3, God gave to Egypt every imaginable affliction. Every imaginable affliction. Obviously, you're familiar too. I'm not telling you anything new here. With these, he systematically took a stab at every single one of Egypt's gods and proved how futile they were, how powerless they were. The god of the frogs could do nothing for their frogs. Pharaoh had to go to Moses and say, please make it stop. Please make it stop. We've had enough. Enough with the frogs. All right? I don't want one more night with the frogs. Letter B, in her rebellion, Israel ignored the truth that God had been a shepherd to them. Look at verse 52. But made his own people to go forth like sheep. All right? These are flocking animals, sheep, goats. These are the kind of animals that find strength and security in numbers, in a group, and it actually literally says, verse 52, that he guided them, he drove them in the wilderness, in the uninhabited land. He drove them like a flock. Verse 53, he led them on safely, securely. Listen to this next line, and think about the wilderness and everything you know about the wilderness. So that they feared not. They lived with no fear. And they lived with no dread. And herein is the model for you and I, to take no thought for the morrow. What ye shall eat, what you shall wear. When God is your shepherd, right? Psalms 23. He provides for his sheep. He provides for his sheep. So that they feared not, but the sea overwhelmed or covered or concealed their enemies. He brought them to the border, to the boundary of his sanctuary. This was God's sacred place, the place where he had established his temporary residence. And obviously we know that to be Sinai, even to this mountain which his right hand hath purchased. All right, purchased, the Old Testament, the Old English notion of purchase was that you owned it, it belonged to you. And God didn't go to some real estate agent and say, hey, I want to buy this from the Egyptians. He erected it. He built it. It belonged to him because he built it. He erected it. He put it there. He owned it. There was nobody else that had any claim to that land because it belonged to him and to him alone. Thirdly is this, they ignored the truth. Rebel Israel ignored the truth that God had been a conqueror for them. That God had been a conqueror for them, especially in the promised land. He expelled the heathen. Right before them, the heathen had to leave. They were pushed out of their places of iniquity, these non-Jewish entities, they were pushed out. And then, what it says there, he divided them. They were caused to fall. They were caused to fail by possession, by property, by the line of their territory. In other words, what he's saying, each one of them fell one at a time. Not one of them withstood. Not one of them held its territory. Not when God was at the helm. Every wicked or heathen people in front of them, God pushed them out. And it literally says, and he made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. Could you imagine? Walking into a big, beautiful, posh tent. Riches, opulence, food. And you didn't work for it. But God gave it. And he says, Asaph, I'm talking about Asaph now, and Asaph says, how much more proof do you want than that? If God never did another miracle, you should be utterly and completely convinced of his love and goodness to you, of his ability and his strength and his power. Look at our application. Oh, we cannot, from this study tonight, we cannot underestimate the power of a thankful heart. A heart that understands and that is careful to remind itself of the good things God has done. There's a lot of grouchy Christians out there, and they're grouchy for no other reason than this. That they have forgotten about all of God's goodness in the past. And all they want is more confirmation of things they want in the future. Remember that? They tempted God. The Israelites here were tempting God. We can take comfort in knowing that God rescued and defended his people. I mean, truly, it proves to us that vengeance belongs to God. God is all powerful. He is strong. He is mighty. There is no one that can harm you and get away with it. They might appear to get away with it in this lifetime, but they will never get away with it. All right. Thirdly is this. Let us indeed not underestimate the need for personal holiness. For the need to draw close to God and stay close to God so that we're able to stay thankful to God, so that we're able to rejoice without ceasing. So that we're able to praise God always and offer up that sacrifice of praise. That we understand when we sing about God and we pray to God and we think about God through our preaching and our teaching. Those things are meant to help us remember what God has done. And for you and I in the New Testament age, obviously we don't live with any kind of national spiritual identity. All right? We are literally a nation of Gentiles is what's happening. We have some Jewish lineage, of course, but we are we are Gog and Magog in many respects. But when you look at that and you realize God has saved us. Jesus Christ died on the cross for us. He purchased our salvation. I mean, what better confirmation of God's power and his love do you need than that one expression? Wow, that's powerful. It is amazing. This study has been a really good eye-opener for me, and it's challenged me on a lot of things. It's an exceptional study. And I hope that what you'll do now is you'll continue thinking about what it means to you and what is required of you. Let's go ahead and go to our prayer bulletins then. Michael will take us off the air. And let's share some prayer requests. We've been asked you to pray